got a little show and tell for you all this morning. I was fearful I lost this in my many moves over the last year, but I found it. It doesn't quite fit me anymore. But this is one of the very first baseball gloves I ever had, and this got me to the championship game in T-ball in the early 90s. It's autographed by Ricky Henderson. It looks like it's been there forever. It really is that, if you remember Ricky Henderson. It has my name written right here. And it got me thinking about some of my favorite memories about growing up with my brothers and a sport we learned to love, which is baseball. My dad loved sports as well, especially baseball, and he passed on that love of the game on to us. And so every spring in Ohio, as the winter snows and ice began to thaw, we knew it was baseball season. I still remember the excitement of going to summer baseball registration days to sign up to play each year. I remember the excitement of putting on the new uniform with our brand new number each season, all except for that one year when we received these uniforms that were bright magenta, sponsored by our local florist. They had a laugh about that. I remember the feel of the dust in my clothes and on my body from the infield. I remember the smells of the oil as I conditioned my glove with that house oil, you know, that WD-40 there. I remember the brightness of the field lights as we gathered on special occasions for those rare night games that we got to play. The sound of the bats hitting the balls. And the taste of ice-cold Pepsi following a long, hot day in the sun of playing ball. I learned to understand baseball as not just a game, but as its own world, where the rest of life seemed to dissipate whenever we entered the ballparks and crossed over those chalk lines of the infield. All this was absolutely amazing, but the first thing my dad taught us was that we had to learn the fundamentals of the game. He explained that in order to fully enjoy playing the game, first one needed to master the basic elements of the game. Throwing, catching, fielding, batting, running, etc. So we practiced, and practiced, and practiced. Now, most of us may know that how boring practice can be for any sport. Baseball is the worst. I wonder how many hours we spent each day standing in the field of some random field, waiting in lines to hit, or simply watching coaches instruct us about form and technique. We just wanted to play ball. But my dad, in all of his wisdom, understood that unless we master the fundamentals, then the deep appreciation that comes with playing the rest of the game will never be realized. And I don't say this often, but he was right. Just like the time and energy it takes to really appreciate anything in life, I need to spend those hours of practice learning the fundamentals in order to truly appreciate the sights, the sounds, feels, the scents, and even the tastes of that game I love. I wonder if people experience the same appreciation when it comes to baseball or anything else for that matter these days. In a world that seems to be obsessed with speed and immediate gratification, many of our traditional, slower practices and activities are being passed over for faster-moving programs and events. Is Christianity one of these things being passed over these days? Is church too slow for people today? Or is there something else that maybe we are missing that has something to do with the lessons of my dad in the sport of baseball? Are people today lacking the fundamentals of Christian faith? And if so, how are we living our lives of faith in this day? I find it interesting that Peter writes about this a little bit in the second letter of to the Christians of his time. These words can apply to us even today. So let's take a look at this letter from Peter. We read today from the second letter of Peter, chapter 1, verses 3 through 11. The children this week learned that this part of the text was discussing how God puts us in the game of life. So let's take a look to see what other messages may be coming from Peter's letter for us this morning. We were reminded in the opening verses of God's call in our lives. As Presbyterians, we understand that God continues to call us as children throughout all of our lives. Peter writes in verse 3, God's divine power has given us everything needed for life and godliness through the knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. Another part of our Presbyterian belief is that we understand and trust in God's promises throughout our history. We call this a covenant theology. God not only wants what is best for us, God has promised time and time again that we will be unconditionally loved all the days of our lives. And we read about that in verse 4. Peter says, thus God has given us through these things His precious and very great promises, so that through them you may escape from the corruption that is in the world because of lust, and may become participants of the divine nature. And then here, beginning in verse 5, Peter lays out some very practical attributes that will help us in our aspirations of living a faithful life. And what I love in particular here is how he eloquently demonstrates how each attribute plays a role in allowing the other to be exuded in our daily living. Verse 5, for this very reason, you must make every effort to support your faith with goodness, and goodness with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with endurance, and endurance with godliness, and godliness with mutual affection, and mutual affection with love. We also hear very similar words in Paul's letter to the Galatians with what he calls the fruits of the Spirit. I wonder if this is Peter's version of teaching the fundamentals of faith to his Christian sisters and brothers in a world and a time that was quite different than ours. It's also amazing to think that perhaps people were actually still very similar to you and I also. We all need to learn the fundamentals if we're going to live this life of Christian faith together. And this is the good news for us this morning, friends. God promises us the tools needed to lead lives of deep, life-giving love. Today we celebrate with our VBS friends that God has called us and promised to provide for us and equips us to do God's work here on this earth. We're not in this alone. We have teammates to share in the game of life. And when we embrace the fundamentals of faith, we understand and appreciate the details of our relationship with our Creator in ways that perhaps at one time seemed unimaginable. And just in case you were wondering, the game of life is not only in here in this sanctuary, but out there, with every day that we live. Friends, may we go into this world ready to get into the game. May we go into this world surrounded by teammates in faith. May we go into this world confident of God's promises in our lives today, tomorrow, and forever. And all of God's children said, Amen.